Good afternoon, and thanks for joining Washington, D.C.-based Jennifer Schaus & Associates in our Get Farsighted in 2020 complimentary webinar series. As you know, the FAR, or Federal Acquisition Regulations, is the rule book that the federal government must follow when making purchases. Our webinar pulls from contracting experts to explain each part of the FAR. It is complimentary and recorded. We will post all of the recordings on our website and YouTube channel, where we have over 400 government contracting webinars available for download. A special thanks to our webinar partner in this series, the National Veterans Small Business Coalition Education Foundation. Please visit their website to learn more about the organization. We would also like to thank our friends at Open the FAR for their sponsorship. If your organization is interested in sponsoring the series or one part, please contact hello@jenniferschaus.com. Now a little bit about us. We work with primarily large businesses to help them navigate the federal marketplace. We work with both product and service companies as well as software firms. Our clients span the globe and include publicly traded organizations in a variety of sectors. We provide market analysis reports, contract administration, contract vehicle assistance, and more. All of our services can also be built into a training course for your team. Learn more about us on our website. We would also like to let you know about some ways to reach government and government contractors through us. We offer advertising and sponsorship opportunities through our weekly newsletter and also in our webinar series. For pricing or to place an order, please email us at hello@jenniferschaus.com. And as noted, we now have over 400 webinars in our archives. As we continue to educate federal contractors, I would like to bring to your attention to our webinar schedule for 2021. The full schedule and speakers are all confirmed. First up is a monthly series called the GovCon Live Q&A Cafe. This is a live webinar series held each month. These will take place on the second Friday of each month in 2021 at 12 p.m. Eastern. We have assembled a group of 4 panelists who are subject matter experts on a specific federal contracting topic. The panelists will make a short presentation about the topics listed here on your screen and then take your live questions about that topic. So for example, January will kick off with our panelists covering CMMC on Friday, January 8th. Our panelists include attorneys, consultants, and other industry professionals. You can sign up on our website under the Q&A Cafe tab. Sponsorships are available. Please email hello@jenniferschaus.com for immediate and pricing details. In our second webinar series in 2021, we will be covering each part of the DFARS, or Defense Federal Acquisition Regulations. Similar to our current FAR series, this will be a weekly series dedicated to defense contracting, its rules and regulations. This series is complimentary and will be held on Wednesday at 12 p.m. Eastern. We will run through the parts sequentially, which means that we start the year with DFARS Part 201 and finish with Part 252 at the end of the year. You can sign up on our website under the DFAR tab. And again, sponsorships are available. Please email hello@jenniferschaus.com for immediate and pricing details. Now let's move on to learn more about today's speaker, Christopher Shiplett. You can find his contact information here. And today we are covering FAR Part 47 with Chris. Thank you so much for joining us today. The floor is now yours.
Thank you very much. Why don't you go ahead and advance to the next slide, where we'll just talk about our agenda very briefly. Good Friday afternoon to you if you're on the East Coast. My name is Chris Shiplett. I'm the founding partner of Randolph Law. We are a government contracts niche law firm that handles all things government contracting for mostly small and mid-sized federal contractors, although a few large federal contractors. Today we're going to talk about FAR Part 47, which is all about transportation. You'll see up here on this slide what our agenda is, and you'll note that we actually go through 2 steps before we get to the specifics of FAR Part 47, and that's because the way that the government buys transportation is a little bit unusual if you're used to a FAR Part 15 acquisition for bespoke services or goods, or you're used to a FAR Part 8 GSA schedule or a FAR Part 12 commercial items. The vast majority of the government's purchase of transportation doesn't come off federal acquisition regulation contracts at all. They come off GSA tenders of service. However, the GSA tenders of service definitely, although they don't necessarily officially incorporate FAR Part 47 and its processes, procedures, and its policies, FAR 47 definitely plays an important referential role in terms of gathering up in one place the way that the government thinks about purchasing transportation. One other note about this, and I think that this is similar to all of the other FAR webinars, is that this is really a survey level because there's so much going on here. You'll see my contact information was just in the previous slide. You'll see it again at the end. I'm happy to answer more detailed questions, and typically what happens when folks are looking at this is they're getting the good survey information, but if you have a specific issue with something, it's always deep, deep, deep within one of the subparts of FAR Part 47 because you have some sort of very specific facts that you're looking at. So happy to answer any questions. You'll see my contact information at the end. And so, and finally, regarding the survey nature, what I've tried to do on the slides you'll see is I've tried to actually list most, if not all, of the sections of FAR Part 47 with very brief notes that I'll refer to as to what they mean without trying to get into too much detail about them. The goal being that this massive 38 slide PowerPoint, you can save it off as kind of a quick reference and kind of an aid memoir when you're thinking about some specific FAR Part 47 problem in the future. So with all that in mind, what we're going to talk about very briefly, we're going to kind of introduce it with how does the government buy transportation. We're going to talk a little bit about how FAR Part 47 fits into that, even for the non-FAR contracts. And then we're going to dig into the specifics of FAR Part 47, of which there are 5 subparts, if you will. Next slide, please. So how does the government buy transportation? Well, there's actually a separate regulation. It's 41 CFR, and it's subpart B that dictates how, if you are a government agent and you are trying to move a person or a good from point A to point B, how you go about doing that. And there's really 4 different ways you can. Number 1 is that GSA, and GSA has an entire division devoted to transportation, which we'll talk about a little bit further on. But GSA's transportation experts have published a standing solicitation. It's not a schedule. It's not a GSA schedule, but it's a standing solicitation, the responses to which are called tenders of service. And so I want to say, I looked up yesterday, I think there might be 1,500 different tenders of service. So functionally, they work like a GSA schedule for a buyer and for a seller as well. There's one solicitation. There's one, each company that wants to have an active tender of service submits a proposal in response to the solicitation. And it's just a very standardized way to find a whole marketplace of companies willing to transport the government's people and goods from point A to point B. So that would really be the first thing that you're looking at is you say, well, I got to transport something point A to point B. I'm going to go to the GSA tenders of service and, use that matching service and that set of contract vehicles to get a solution to my problem. Second thing is that some agencies publish their own tenders of service. And so if the agency that you're in, the agency that you're dealing with has their own agencies, their own tenders of service, you can do that. You can use that to move people and goods. Note here, I've said if the terms of the agreement allow, there are a few non-GSA GWACS tenders of service, and if an agency's tenders of service, if the terms make it a GWAC and it fits, you can do that, use that vehicle. So the third thing here would be contract directly with a vendor. The government can contract directly, with a proposed vendor in the same way that most folks are familiar with the solicitation and proposal process for contracts for goods or contracts for services. That would be the most direct use of this FAR Part 47. And we'll kind of go through the specifics of how that looks. That's really what the bulk of this is about. And then finally, an agency can negotiate their own rate tender. So, an agency has a need. They say, well, GSA's tenders don't match our specific requirements in terms of value and price and services offered. There's no other agency contracts out there. We don't, for whatever policy or procedure or operational reasons, want to just issue a FAR-based solicitation. So we're going to take GSA's process for negotiating or proposing or RFPing and receiving a response to a tender of service, and we're going to negotiate our own tender of service. I've quoted the statutes there. Those are what they're called in the slide, the transportation procurement statutes. Those are the laws to which this 41 CFR sort of, I guess, expands on, and those basically are those are the laws that govern how the government can purchase transportation. Next slide, please. So within that broader concept and non-FAR-based acquisition regime, how does FAR Part 47 even work? Well, number one, the third of those four possibilities, you negotiate your own contract. The policies that would apply to that contract would be here within FAR Part 47. And the contract clauses, although they wouldn't be in FAR Part 47 themselves, they'd be in 52. They would be coming out of and referenced from the policies in FAR Part 47. The other thing is that a great deal of government acquisition going through these tenders of service come on bills of lading. And for survey and kind of general overview process, a bill of lading is essentially an order for the movement of a particular shipment. If you, as an agency, use a GSA tender of service, or use an agency tender of service, or negotiate your own tender of service, those are going to be functionally equivalent to what in services and goods contracts are an IDIQ. And then you would use an actual bill of lading to request and track and pay for and receive the specific movement of a specific good or person or set of goods. So within that concept, within the tenders concept, then FAR Part 47 really talks through the best practices in policies and in procedures for using bills of lading. All right, next slide, please. FAR Part 47 is 5 subparts. There's a general policy subpart. There's 2 subparts that talk to actual types of contract. One is direct contracts for transportation. Again, sort of you're going to issue the FAR equivalent of your own tender of service. There's also, and I see this third part used more often than any of the other ones, this issue of including transportation and accounting for transportation issues within supply contracts, right? When the government purchases a quantity of a specific goods, it can purchase it FOB destination, where it's the contractor's responsibility to get it to where the government's going to receive it, or it can purchase it FOB origin, where it's the contractor's responsibility to simply hand over ownership of the good at the contractor's facility or at at kind of a shipping point. And in between those, the contracting officers have the ability to consider transportation issues, even if the main contract is is a contract for supply. The last two are specific Buy American style, the implementation of specific Buy American style laws. If an agency is using air transport, it's required to use U.S. flag carriers, except in specific exceptions. And this subsection of FAR Part 47, the fourth one, talks through that in great detail. Same thing with ocean transport. So those are the 5 parts we'll go through, and we're going to go through them each in sequence. I'll mention one more time, it is a survey, and so I'm going to go fairly quickly through the entirety of it and try and hit really the high points of each section. But a great deal of this stuff, as you will see, is highly fact-specific, and so for answers to specific issues you run into, you're going to kind of start right in the middle of a specific subpart and then work your way back up. All right, next slide, please. All right, so the first kind of section is just the general policies, and I think that the most important policies here are a real preference, well, 2 things. Number one, a real preference for using bills of lading as the contract form for specific movements of goods or people. And this comes up many, many different times within the FAR section. And basically, if it's a domestic move, then the government requires that the move be I guess, contracted with a commercial bill of lading, which would be the vendor's bill of lading, but with government notations. And that is basically the commercial bill of lading is the contract, but the government notations, which are described in this section, are and in the contract clause as part of this section, which we'll talk about a little later. Those notations are kind of the standard government contracting clauses that are applied to any commercial contract. If the government accepts a vendor's commercial contract, it only does so in this instance, in the instance of FAR Part 12 acquisitions, and any other instance, in the instance of software under an end-user licensing agreement, the government only accepts a commercial contract with specific additions that are required by statute. And in the context of movements, those additions are called notations, and they are placed on the commercial bills of lading that you use. For international, GSA has a form, the SF1103, which is the government version of a bill of lading, and the SF1203 is just the continuation form. That's how you make a movement internationally. The second piece of it, and this is really key, is the first part in the FAR where it really talks about a transportation office. GSA has transportation offices to support civilian activities. The Department of Defense has transportation commands to support military activities. And you'll see all through FAR Part 47 this ranging from a suggestion to a demand that contracting officers, as they consider transportation concepts, refer to the transportation office, the transportation officer, for help with that. And the real policy here is that the government has developed expertise in moving things, and in really more specifically contracting for moving things. And that expertise resides in the transportation offices and the transportation officers. So contracting officers don't go wing it. Go refer to the transportation office, transportation officer, get the expert help you need. Finally, the other two things in the general policies are expressing a general preference to ship government goods and services by commercial carriers rather than using government vehicles, and a general note that there should be no preference, the government expresses no preference for shipment by a particular mode. There's a couple other policies here that talk about small business participation and that type of thing. The second policy on this is sort of subsidiary to the general policies, but that the government generally does not purchase transportation insurance, that the government assumes the risk of loss or retains the risk of loss of goods as they move through the transportation system. And if a particular action, contracting officer believes that a particular action requires the purchase of insurance, they need to essentially justify it and document it. All right, next slide, please. This section, this 103, really talks about this idea of auditing and monitoring the cost that the government pays for transportation. So GSA, the division that manages these various tenders, is the Transportation Division, and GSA also has the Transportation Audit Division that supports GSA's mandatory ongoing transportation cost audit program. So for any transportation contract that's not through GSA, that the agency's running themselves, they have to do two things. Number one is the agency has to establish their own or reference their own prepayment audit program to continually monitor the costs of transport. And then number two, GSA runs the post-payment audit program, and agencies are required to submit invoices that they've paid, and bundle them all up, and on a monthly basis submit all of their invoices for transportation costs to the GSA Transportation Audit Division to allow GSA to carry out its mission of continually monitoring government transportation costs. The third piece of it, I apologize, there's a typographical error, that should be 47.103-3, are just the contract clauses that should be inserted in either a contract or annotated onto a bill of lading that establish the contractor obligation to comply with these two audit programs. All right, let's look to next slide. Okay, and this is 47.104, which talks generally about the rate tenders. Now, again, I mentioned all the way at the top that this FAR clause 47, or FAR part 47, it kind of stands alone, but it also references or refers to the non-FAR, and kind of establishes a framework for these non-FAR transportation acquisitions. This is really the main subsection of this FAR part that talks about that. So 47.104 really explains the concept of common carriers, which is the kind of legal name for transporters of goods and goods and people. That common carriers are often subject to the jurisdiction of an entity called the Surface Transportation Board. And this is why, I think, why the government transportation purchasers are outside the FAR, because many transportation, movements of goods and people are governed by the Interstate Commerce Act, and the Surface Transportation Board often sets rate schedules. And so you're not really operating in kind of a free commercial environment. The government's purchase of transportation is tied into this requirement that these common carriers establish rate schedules that the government itself, in a separate area, reviews and approves. So again, this section, this 104, really talks about kind of what the rate tender procedures are, how the government establishes rate tenders, specific requirements that the rates that these rate tenders that are in these rate tenders are reduced from the commercial rates, and that the commercial rates may or may not be regulated rates. The processes by which an agency can establish these tenders. So, for example, agencies are allowed to negotiate for additional reductions on rates off of an already published rate tender. I think the important part of here is this 104-2 and 104-3. And so if there is an established fixed price contract where the delivery term is FOB destination, then those contracts are entirely accepted from the idea of rates for transport, because transport's already been negotiated in. If there is a fixed contract with FOB origin, then there's sort of a brief discussion in this section about how the contractor uses that they should they've got this fixed contract, but then they've got this cost component, which is the shipping from their FOB origin to the government's location. And that talks about how a contractor needs to use a commercial bill of lading and how the reimbursement would go. The second piece of this 104-3, really talks mainly about the fact that these two regulations, 107.21 and 137.12, that establish the whole premise of government purchasing transportation, in their language really talk about only the government's purchasing for the shipment of government goods. While there's a possibility that a contractor could purchase shipment of government goods, or a contractor could purchase a shipment of contracted goods that are ultimately going to be turned over to the government at the end, an FOB destination contract. This section establishes procedures for allowing a contractor to purchase shipping on behalf of the government, and allowing that contractor to have access to the discounted rates that are established under tenders under 49 USC 10721 and 13712. The other piece is that there's each section of this FAR clause references specific contract clauses that are included in any contracts that basically implement these policies. And then certain administrative things, like if you're using a bill of lading, you have to endorse onto the bill of lading which government rate tender the bill of lading reference is issued under. And then finally, we come back to, and this is very important, actually we'll go to the next slide. I separated this out on the next slide because it's so important. Again, this suggestion / demand that contracting officers not go solo on trying to figure out transportation, use your transportation assistance. And there's two sources of civilian assistance, either the GSA Regional Federal Supply Service Bureau for the geographic location of your particular activity, or if you're on a service tender or a tender that's not a GSA tender, then the contract issuing office has to have a transportation element, and that's where you find assistance in the civilian world. Similar thing in the military world, where the transportation office of the contracting activity or the military activity, but the military also has a separate command, the Military Service Deployment and Distribution Command, that offers transportation assistance to buyers of supplies and activities that need to move people. So this is really, honestly, frankly, at least from the government side, the most important piece of all of it. This is where you get your assistance in trying to figure out your transportation problems. These are the government contracting or the government experts in moving goods and moving people. Next slide, please. All right, we're on to the second of the 5 subparts of FAR Part 47, and this really deals with contracts, actual contracts for solicitation. The first section of it really just talks about when planning a contract for transportation, what things the contracting officer and the activity need to think about. So, for example, this 47202 pre-solicitation planning, the policy is ensure that you are planning your acquisition far enough in advance to cover 3 things. Number one is that many transportation contracts are governed by the Service Contract Act for service personnel. If it's a Service Contract Act acquisition, then the contracting office needs to develop a wage statement. That takes time. That takes coordination with the Department of Labor and can't be done overnight. The other 2 things that are really important in pre-solicitation planning are the contractor being allowed to inspect government facilities, either origination or destination facilities, and government being allowed to inspect contractor proposed facilities, either origination or destination facilities. Additional clauses here, all of the language talks about this kind of IDIQ with bill of lading or tender that governs just rates and terms generally, and then a bill of lading for a specific movement. This particular subpart really talks about you can issue a contract for a single movement. It's not prohibited. You don't have to use a bill of lading for a single movement, but only if the circumstances warrant. And then this particular clause actually goes in and talks about what circumstances might warrant it. Other things that are here in kind of the general introduction to contracts for transportation and policies. Again, 47.205, hey, contracting officer, don't go off on your own. rely on GSA and rely on DoD, and this really, the availability of term contracts and basic ordering agreements, it basically just says, hey, we already have contracts for this, right? There are 1,500 tenders in GSA. The agencies have additional tenders. There's transportation offices kind of in every area of the country and all over the world. So please, rely on the transportation office. 47206 relates FAR 47 back to other clauses of the FAR. So a FAR-based contract for transportation services is going to necessarily be governed by all of the applicable clauses of the FAR. This says, hey, even though we're in this weird realm where there's other regulations that govern transportation, use all the FAR clauses, but FAR 47 clauses supersede other clauses if they contradict each other. And don't forget to put in the specific FAR Part 47 clauses. All right, next slide. This really just talks about specific solicitation provisions that should be in every solicitation for transportation, and they govern kind of all of the P's and Q's of transportation, qualifying the offers, making sure that they are, have all of the requirements for being allowed to handle whatever transportation they're proposing, that they have operating authorities. This actually refers back to the inspection, which we talked about before in terms of allowing time to make an inspection. This clause really talks about how to insert a clause that requires an inspection of shipping and receiving facilities. This includes clauses for the duration of the contract, describing the shipment, how the weight of the shipment will be determined, and agreed upon what contractor responsibilities are, the rates, liability, insurance, government responsibilities, annotation, discrepancies, and volume movement. So this really just generally lays out all of the pieces of the FAR 47 transportation specific clauses that you're going to want to put as a contracting officer into a solicitation to ensure it complies with FAR Part 47. Next slide, please. There's one specific additional aspect that I think is very important. This is a rep ship or a report of shipment in any contract for the shipment of classified or otherwise protected material, explosives, radioactive material, otherwise controlled material, or anywhere where the destination points require advance notice of shipment, then it is expected that the contract will include and must include this clause 52247-68, which is a clause, a very detailed clause that obligates the contractor who's shipping to follow the proper rep ship processes to notify the destination of the, I guess, the intended shipment and the, excuse me, the day and time of the arrival of the shipment and that type of thing. All right, 47.3, next slide. So then the next piece of it is where the government has supply contracts, but it's advantageous to the government to in some way insert into that supply contract a manner in which the goods will be moved from the contract owner to the government owner. And so this is what this entire section deals with. It's structured very similar to the last section where you've got the policy, then you've got specific solicitation clauses, then you've got a couple other administrative issues. Two things to note here, that this generally applies, that this is specifically applicable to fixed price contracts for goods. That is to say that if the government is entering into a fixed price contract for goods and wants to consider transportation, they would look to FAR 47.3 for the proper clauses in the solicitation and the contract. But also, and you see this in a couple different places in the FAR, it's not mandatory to include these clauses in a contract where the transportation piece is cost reimbursable, but these clauses can be used as a guide for what I'll call best practices in government policies and government procedures. Next slide. And we come back to, you'll notice here we've got one subpart and three subparts. This entire section says use the transportation office. That's literally the entirety of that section. It says for contractors, I'll actually read it to you. Transportation and traffic management factors are important. Contracting activity shall consider transportation and the requiring activity shall provide the contracting office with information for the contracting officer to consider the transportation. 47.301-1, contracting office sub B shall request transportation office participation, especially before making an initial acquisition of supplies that are unusually large, heavy, high, wide, or long. So if you take nothing else from this, presentation, you've seen it in 5 places already. Use your transportation office. Transportation officers, make yourselves available to the contracting office to draw on your expertise. The only slightly more complicated thing is this idea of the defense transport system. If this is a DoD acquisition or for whatever reason it's using military transportation capabilities, Department of Defense has an extra regulation, which is this 4500.9-R, and a contracting officer in a civilian context that is using the military transportation system, or contracting officer in a military context that's using the military transportation system, needs to make sure that this particular regulation is incorporated into any contract and is followed. All right, next slide. So this particular clause talks about the place of delivery. Because this subsection deals with transportation issues when the primary purpose of the contract is the purchase of goods. There is a lot more, I don't want to say flexibility, but there's a lot more need to consider where is the place of delivery of the goods. So, and that would be the FOB point. So this particular subclause really talks about how the contracting office should consider where to take delivery of the goods. And there's actually, I think I wrote it down here, 47.304, this actually mainly references 47.304, which is the clause that really talks about how you decide which place of delivery as the contracting office you should insert into the solicitation. Next slide, please. So each of 47.303 is essentially a different FOB point, right? You've got origin, if the origin's a contractor's facility, you've got destination, you've got free alongside the vessel at the port of shipment, and really all of these 16 sub-clauses do 3 things. Number 1, they describe what these terms mean. You know, what does, for 303-9, FOB vessel at the port of shipment, what does that mean? And I think that the reason for describing this is the presumption that the contracting office looking to incorporate these policies into a contract is mainly expert in the purchase of the supplies themselves and not expert in the transport of the supplies. Then for each of these subsections, there's really 2 additional pieces. Number 1, describing the So first it describes what it means. What does FOB destination mean? Then it describes in terms of, let's say, FOB destination, what the contractor's responsibilities would be. So for example, I'm looking specifically at FOB destination. In the case of a supply contract with a transportation component that's FOB destination, the contractor shall pack and mark the shipment to comply with specifications, prepare and distribute commercial bills of lading, deliver the shipment in good order, et cetera, et cetera. And so each of these subsections really define the contractor responsibilities for that particular method of delivery. And then finally, each of these includes a reference to the contract clause. Once the contracting officer has decided, we're going to include transportation considerations. We're going to ship it FOB destination within consignee's premises because that's most advantageous to the government. Then the end of each of these subclauses has a listing or has a link to what specific clause or clauses should be included in solicitations and in contracts with that particular method of delivery. Next slide, please. Okay, so the only sort of more nuanced delivery is with this idea of supply contracts, the shipment of what they call small package shipments, basically. And kind of my thing is, I call this the FedEx rule, right, or FedExit rule, right? If a contractor is shipping small things, and small is defined as under 150 pounds for air shipments or under 1,000 pounds for other methods, you know, this particular subpart has established much simpler rules for shipping those things. You don't have to go through the whole bill of lading procedure and stuff like that. You can, number one, you can use the contractor's own shipping method, or rather you can authorize the contractor to use their own shipping method and to use what they call common carriers and commercial bill of ladings that they prep, and that's basically FedEx. They can also, contracting officer can also allow shipments to be consolidated. They can allow government purchased items to be shipped consolidated with contractor purchased items. So if the government's purchasing a set of, I don't know, let's say a set of laptops or something like that on a contract, and the contractor happens to also be shipping internally purchased laptops for their own use, contracting officer can authorize the government-owned portion of that shipment to be bundled with the contractor-owned portion of that shipment that has nothing to do with the government's purchase, and that type of thing. And then it just has rules for how that works. How do you document those shipments? And how do you determine that it is okay as a contracting officer to allow a contractor to make these small package shipments? Next slide, please. This is the 47.304 that we were talking about. This actually describes the government's policies for which of those 17 different delivery methods the government should require. Generally, government prefers FOB origin, that's 304-1, but from the starting point of a preference for FOB origin in supply contracts, the government should, or the contracting office should really consider what's most advantageous, and that's where you go back through all of the different types and the specific circumstances of the supply and of the shipments, figure out what would be cheapest, fastest, overall most advantageous. In terms of shipments within CONUS, the government must allow for either FOB origin or FOB destination, and allow the contractor to propose either with a cost. If there are exceptions where the government is choosing a different delivery method for within CONUS-based shipments of supplies under supply contracts, or not allowing a contractor to propose one or the other of origin, FOB origin or FOB destination, contracting office should document that. In terms of from CONUS to overseas, the strong preference is for FOB origin, If it's not FOB origin, then you have to document an exception to why it's most advantageous to the government to use some other method of delivery of the goods. For shipments originating outside CONUS, you can use either FOB origin or FOB destination without having to explain why you're choosing destination over origin. However, same as within CONUS, if it's an exception to one of those two, you have to explain why. And then finally, 304-5, this really gives a very good little general walkthrough of what circumstances might warrant an exception to these strong preferences for FOB origin or FOB origin and FOB destination. Again, like everything else, it says, you should really contact your transportation officer. Next slide, please. Similar to the contracts just for transportation, this is an entire section that really talks about the nuances of specific solicitation provisions, specific factual patterns, specific things that might come up, and essentially, again, there's kind of two sections to it. Number one, it explains the concept, the fact pattern that might come up, and then number two, it says insert these particular contract clauses if you have this fact pattern. So, for example, 305-5, destination unknown. It describes if the destination is unknown, which delivery method should you use, and it should be FOB origin, and then what is the process for documenting that, and finally including a specific clause within the solicitation or the contract. Next slide, please. This talks about how to deal with transportation in evaluating the cost of a supply contract. And number one, and first and foremost, and incredibly important, is that the government must consider the cost of transporting the supplies that it purchases when it's considering and evaluating the cost of the purchase of those supplies. So then, what is the manner and the process by which the government considers that? And that would be found in 306-1. And it describes, so first off, you're supposed to contact a transportation officer. 306-1 describes the information that the contracting officer must give to the transportation officer. Then 306-2 describes the information the transportation officer must give back to the contracting officer to allow the contracting officer to determine a final evaluated transportation cost, which then gets added to the direct cost of the supplies to make a final evaluated price for a supply contract where transportation is a consideration, which is all of them. Importantly, there is a specific requirement for the date that the transportation officer must use as the rates, and that is that transportation officer has to give the lowest published rates as of the date of the bid opening or the due date of offers. And of course, the reason for that is to make it fair for bidders who might be providing supplies from different locations. So a great, very specific example I've dealt with recently is the provision of trucks under a foreign military sales contract. And, the truck's ultimate destination is in the continent of Africa, on the west side of the continent of Africa. But various bidders may have proposed procuring those trucks from destinations or from origins as different as from Spain or from Ukraine or from Brazil. And the contract must include, in that case, and the evaluation must include transporting those trucks and a price for transporting those trucks, from each of those possible origins to the destination. And to make things fair among all of the contractors for evaluation purposes, not for ultimate payment purposes, but for evaluation purposes, all of those transportation costs must be based on rates that are exactly the same day, which for sealed bidding is on bid opening. For negotiated procurement, it's on the date that offers are due. Finally, the contracting office must consider the adequacy of shipping facilities. So that this is kind of dovetails nicely into the requirement that in planning for a solicitation of supplies where there's a transportation component, that the government considers the government allows time for evaluation of the facilities. Next slide, please. Okay, this is the first of two kind of Buy American sections of FAR Part 47, and this basically gives the requirements for air transport, that the government must transport goods and people by air on U.S. flagged carriers. So there's really two things that implement this. There's the Fly America Act, which you see referenced up above at the top, that basically says that people moving on government orders must use U.S. flag carriers, and if they are moving personal effects or property, they must use U.S. flag carriers. And then there was a GAO guidelines published in 1981 that really essentially turned into this particular subsection of FAR 47, which implement that act. Next slide, please. So basically, if a U.S. flag carrier is available, it must be used. There is no most advantageous to the government. There's no trade-off evaluation. There's no convenience evaluation. It's simply if a U.S. flag air carrier is available to move persons or those persons' personal effects or property, it must be used. Next slide. Actually, sorry, go back to that one. I want to make one more point about that one, which is that I think one of the most important considerations in this particular FAR subpart is the question of what does available mean. And there are very complex and very thorough rules regarding essentially the availability of flights to a particular place. And, the availability of the flight starts with a consideration of the origin of the travel movement and the destination of the travel movement, and then also any intermediary hubs, basically. And so there are very intricate rules for determining, for example, if there is no U.S. flag carrier from the last intermediate stop to the destination, at what point are you allowed to transfer from a U.S. flag carrier to a non-U.S. flag carrier? Same thing with the origin, and same thing with any two intermediate steps where there might not be a U.S. flag carrier available. So point being this 47303-1 C through F describe the rules for determining whether U.S. flag air carrier is available or unavailable. Next slide, please. Contracting offices are allowed to use air transport agreements. And if there is an air transport agreement, you are allowed to use a foreign carrier that is allowed under that air transport agreement to transport U.S. people and U.S. Goods. Next slide, please. If a movement is accomplished with a non-U.S. flag carrier, there's a penalty. Either, number one, you have to explain when you submit a voucher for reimbursement of the cost, you have to explain why a U.S. flag carrier was not available. Also, the penalty to the office, the contract office for using a non-U.S. flag carrier will not be based on the cost, but it would be based on the loss of revenue for the U.S. flag carrier. Next slide, please. Agencies are allowed to use international freight forwarders, but here's the key. You have to inquire of those freight forwarders which carriers they use, and any goods that are being moved by use of an international freight forwarder, the freight forwarder still has to comply with the rules for the use of U.S. flag carriers. Also, any contract with the forwarder should include, whether there's a specific contract clause that there's references that requires the forwarder to include the justifications we just talked about if it doesn't use U.S. flag carriers. Next slide, please. Finally, this is easy. In 403-5, you can find all of the contract clauses that need to go into contracts for carriage or contracts with freight forwarders that implement all of these, or even in service contracts or goods contracts where there might be an air transport component for moving people or their personal effects. All the contract clauses are found here. Next slide, please. This is the last section, and it's very similar to the prior section. This talks about ocean transport. There are 1, 2, 3 on this slide, and then 1, 2, 3 on the next slide. Policies and laws that mandate that for any contract that anticipates ocean transport of goods, that there is a preference for U.S. flagged vessels. Next slide, please. These are the additional laws. Next slide after that, please. So these are the detailed rules for it. Basically, it essentially describes, what supplies this particular provision applies. So it's supplies owned by the government if they're in possession of the government, a contractor, or a subcontractor. Supplies for use of the government that are contracted but aren't yet delivered. Supplies that are not owned by the government but are being transported for distribution to foreign assistance programs. Government-owned supplies that are to be shipped commercially, et cetera, et cetera. Basically, this defines very specifically what supplies this U.S. flagged vessels transport clause is applicable to. Next slide, please. There are some exceptions to the requirement for using U.S. flagged vessels if there is another law or a treaty that requires shipment aboard a specific vessel or a specific type of vessel. That law or treaty supersedes this set of clauses. If there are supplies going between foreign countries and those supplies were purchased with foreign currencies and those foreign currencies were made available under the Foreign Assistance Act of 1961, then you don't have to apply this. So again, specific exceptions. One notable exception is if there are classified supplies being shipped and the classification prohibits the use of a non-government vessel. You'll recall previously there's a preference for using non-government carriers rather than government vehicles, and then that would cause any supplies to go under this ocean transport. However, if the classification says you can't use a non-government vessel, then this doesn't apply, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All of the exceptions are listed here in 47504. Next slide, please. And we're coming to the end of this survey. There's this brief discussion and the next one. Construction contracts oftentimes are partially paid for or paid for in partnership with a foreign nation. If the recipient nation is, if it's a military assistance or a foreign aid and the recipient destination is paying at least 50% of the transportation costs, then you can use foreign flagged vessels for up to 50% of the gross tonnage. And there is a disconnect here. The foreign assistance has to be at least 50%, and you can use it for up to 50% of the gross tonnage. Final note here, and then I'll conclude very, very briefly because I know we're almost at the end of time. Go ahead and hit the next slide. 47506 and 47507 talks, just as the other subparts, about the contract clauses and about the procedures. Again, and I cannot stress this enough for contracting offices, use your transportation officer, especially for ocean transport. This number 2 or this number 3 is very interesting. It warns a contracting officer to double, I guess, kind of take a very close look at situations where there's a claim by the actual shipping activity that a U.S. flagged vessel is not available, and to go back to the transportation officer and really look at that in those cases. Next slide, and the end. So that is essentially an overview of FAR Part 47. Again, the government purchase of transportation is kind of an odd mix of the FAR and other things, and it's a large and complicated area of regulation. I hope this has been a useful survey. I hope you at least got sort of a sense of where to start in your search for answers to any specific questions you might have about the transportation of goods, under transportation contracts, under supply contracts with the transportation component, or any other areas of government regulation of the transportation of government goods. If you do have any questions, there is my contact information right there. And with that, I will turn it back over to you.
Thank you for a great presentation, Chris. And to our audience members, we thank you again for participating with us. If you have questions about this part, please contact our speaker with the contact information seen on your screen. And if you have any questions about federal contracting or need assistance with any of our services, please contact us directly. Thank you again for joining us. This concludes today's webinar.